Audio streaming is on. I probably should give more warning. I'm sorry. But good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Please bear with me a moment while I get everything started. We are hosting officially our largest show of all time tonight. So I'll do things a little out of order. I post links so we don't just have dead air. And Brian, why don't you introduce yourself, and maybe by the time you're done, I can get this. I'll have us ready to go.
Okay. Yes, as always, I am Brian McKinley, author of vampire thrillers, general skeptic to Kevin's Believer, Scully to Mulder, and all around co-host and key jingler.
And Daniel, I just put the link in the chat.
Thank you.
I'll have it on my Facebook in a moment. And since I'm picking on you and I'm still getting ready to post links, why don't you introduce yourself and the project so that we can get things going, and then we can all go around and introduce ourselves until I'm ready.
I am Danielle Ackley McPhail, and it's all my fault. I am the publisher of eSpec Books and the editor of the Forgotten Lore series, which is created in conjunction with the Telltale Steampunk Festival. And we create the anthologies that go with the literary scavenger hunt they hold each year at the event. They have a theme author from the 19th century, and then we do our anthology inspired by that author. This time there are two. The collection is an assembly of monsters, and it is based on the works of Bram Stoker and Mary Shelley. Hey, there you go.
Thank you, Keith, for the visual aids.
The first book in the series, which is A Cast of Crows. And the second one is A Cry of Hounds, which is Poe and Arthur Conan Doyle.
Okay, and we're good. I just posted all of the links. So it's on YouTube, it's on Facebook, my personal account, my Delaware Valley Demonology, and my Paranormal Encyclopedia. So it's everywhere I have access to put it. So to get a slightly... Did you have more you want to say, Danielle? I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, we're good.
Okay, so for those of you who may not know, because hopefully we get some new people, my name's Kevin Mears. I'm a demonologist, Paranormal Encyclopedia, and the host of this show. Tonight, as Danielle said, we're going to be talking about an assembly of monsters. And that's enough about me, because we're here to talk about our guests. Aaron, you're the next person in line, as I see on my screen, so why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I get that a lot since, the double lane name, it's alphabetical. I always get to go first. I'm Aaron Rosenberg. I write novels, children's books, role-playing games, short stories, pretty much anything people pay me for. I've been in both of the other two anthologies for Danielle, done a couple of other projects with eSpec Books, including a cryptid series starting with Yeti Left Home, did a book for Systema Paradoxa, and then I've done a bunch of tie-in novels and original novels for various other people.
Awesome. Doc, do you want to go next?
Hi there. I am Doc Coleman. I write steampunk comedy adventure. And I've got my own novel out there. That's The Perils of Prague. And I've also got a collection of short stories out there. I've been in a couple other anthologies, and I've been in each of the Forgotten Lore anthologies. So I'm happy to be here and to help promote this because I'm having fun doing this.
They're a lot of fun.
And Keith?
Hi, I'm Keith R. De Candido. I have written a ridiculous number of books, or a number of ridiculous books, depending on which Amazon reviews you read. I've written more than 60 novels, more than 100 short stories, more than 70 comic books, and more nonfiction that I'm entirely comfortable counting because I'm bad at that. And relevant to this chat, I've only been in one previous Forgotten Lore anthology before this, not all three. But I've been writing stuff for eSpec since its inception a decade ago. including my Precinct series of fantasy police procedurals, my Adventures of Bromgold urban fantasy novels, and contributed to a bunch of different anthologies. I'm also a huge Mary Shelley fan goober. And when Telltale Steampunk announced that it was going to be Mary Shelley and Bram Stoker, I made it clear to Danielle that if I was not in this book, there was going to be violence. So that's why I'm in this book.
Now you see why my hair is white.
Keith will do that to most
I
people.
wondered
I do,
about that.
yeah. It's an effect I have on most of my editors, actually.
And Jessica, that brings us to you.
Hi, everybody. I am Jessica Lucci. I am a poet and steampunk author, and I am very proud to have my stories included in all 3 volumes of the Forgotten Lore series. I'm best known for my Watch City series, which takes place on land, sea, and air, so I get a lot of steampunk elements in there, as well as a lot of history. I like to incorporate modern issues while using history as a backdrop, because a lot of the issues we face now, they faced then in the Victorian era. So
Absolutely true.
Yeah.
And last but never least, Dacre.
Well, hi guys. Yeah, I'm Dacre Stoker, great grandnephew of Bram Stoker, obviously the author of one of our patron saints here today. And I'm an author myself. I've co-authored 2 international bestsellers and a number of nonfiction books as well. I also have the fortunate experience of guiding our host, Kevin Mears, around Transylvania and getting him back to you guys alive. This was a challenge, but he was well behaved. It's just that he managed to conjure up all kinds of spirits along the way, and we grabbed his ass and brought him out of very difficult places from weird castles. So I'm here to talk to you about my great-granduncle's contributions to what inspired some of the writers, these esteemed writers in this podcast tonight, because it's really interesting the way Bram, even before Danielle thought of this, way back in 1897. I don't think you're quite that old, Danielle, even though with the nice gray hair you're sporting. But Bram was thinking, you know, one of the famous quotes, and I'll just leave you with this and let Kevin get on with this. But in his journal that I found, this was in my cousin's, his great-grandson's attic. He wrote, "Story of a man brought back to life in a dissecting room by application of a new power unexpected." Now that's Bram, the Dracula writer, already thinking stuff that Shelley had probably already thought about, but that was on the minds of people in the Victorian era at the time. Yeah. So that's why it's so cool to be part of this anthology. Is it's such a logical connection, a blending of minds, of science and reason, and all the other experimentation and masses advances of science at the time. So glad to be here. And Kevin, hand it back to you, buddy.
I think you make a really good point, and it's an interesting thing about these 2 authors. I mean, there's arguments for other people, but in many ways, Mary Shelley is the mother of the science fiction genre.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and she's such an iconic part of Gothic horror, but that she also bridged into science fiction. And we've talked about before, Dacre, Bram also incorporated a lot of the current science for his day in his novel.
Yeah. Yeah, no, he did. He was really into technology on stage at the Lyceum Theater. And it's interesting how you could see he incorporated that into the novel Dracula as a way to say, look, we've got some new tech. We need this stuff to battle the supernatural, the telegrams, the telegraphs, the searchlights, and of course, fringe sciences, the mesmerism that was just coming along, Joseph Mesmer. And remember, guys, this is a time, Shelley wrote in the early 1900s, but Charles Darwin was smack in the middle. If you want to talk science fiction, Origin of the Species certainly rocked people, on their behinds, both in science and religion. And I think Bram reacted to that as people were thinking, wait a sec, you mean religion's not telling us everything? We can now lean on science and look for answers elsewhere. And by golly, they sure did, which gave rise to Freemasonry, Golden Dawn, Hellfire Club, all these other cool places behind the scenes that people were allowed to think rationally, or maybe think beyond what was rational at the time. That opened up science thinking and science fiction.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say that was the era of the first fallout of the Enlightenment, which is also what led to the revolutions that were going on both here and in France, and also what led and eventually the technological revolution. The advances in technology led to the Industrial Revolution. all of that was all over the place, and that was a lot of the literature of the 19th century, not just Shelley and Stoker, but all over the place, was about those changes and what that would mean for people. Well, I mean, Stoker was obviously very much up on current technologies. A lot of the stuff, besides the stuff you mentioned, there was also the wax recordings that a lot of the letters were recorded on in Dracula. And Shelley was hugely up on a lot of the current theories. She mentions Erasmus Darwin in the Introduction to Frankenstein. She was also familiar with Madame de Stael's theories about galvanism and stuff like that, a lot of which influenced Frankenstein. There was so much stuff happening in the wake of the Enlightenment and with the advances of technology that happened throughout the 19th century that everybody was glomming onto, as well as looking at the philosophical implications of a lot.
That's
so. What I'm sorry. Go ahead.
For me, that's one of the things I love about steampunk as a genre, because it pulls from that Victorian era, and it's a time when anything is possible. You can combine science with the magic of ancient Egypt, with witches, with fairies at the bottom of your garden, and you can all go flying off to Venus and talk to the aliens there. It was all in the realm of what they'd accept.
And there was so much arising at that time, both the scientific discoveries, the archaeological discoveries, and all of that inspires. I mean, we want to tell stories, and it's all just fodder for it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a history major for a reason. So the thing I was going to say before you guys made a perfect example of the point I was about to make is when we do interviews like this, neither Brian nor I like to do it like a formal interview you see on most radio or most television, because I find that boring. What we prefer to do is exactly this, is have a conversation with people. So please feel encouraged to insert your own opinions, your own ideas. Don't take anything as a question to just one person. I want to hear what everyone has to say.
So it's also what a lot of YouTube people like to call low effort content.
We like to call them viewers.
Yeah,
because hopefully they're watching.
Well, I mean,
we're big on low effort.
Don't have to do much. We just let you guys talk.
Yeah, as you've noticed, it's not a problem getting us to talk. It's a problem getting us to shut up.
I'm also guilty of that problem. But no, this is perfect. I know that we have at least one regular viewer watching, and so I wanted to say a quick hello to Lisa for Truth, who is a fellow YouTuber and a friend of the channel.
Hi, Lisa.
Hey, Lisa.
But no, it's a good space. It's a lot of fun. So, let's see. I'm trying to think of a good question, particularly since the one I had kind of just got answered. Brian, what do you? Brian, what about you?
Well, an easy place to start is for the people that have contributed a story to the anthology. Give us a elevator pitch of what your story is.
Excellent idea.
So for me, because these are by invitation and I sell at events, I always have a story in my own collections. It's easier to sell that way. and I know what I'm looking for. So for mine, all of my stories in the Forgotten Lore series have dealt with my character, Lena, who is recruited by Santa Muerte. The very first story with Lena was in Afterpunk, and it explored the Day of the Dead. So all of the stories are set in Mexico, and whatever the theme is, I find a way to interpret that through her viewpoint. So it was a little tricky this time. I had to look up a lot of different South American monsters, and I actually found a very creepy way to acknowledge both Stoker and Shelley. I'm not going to give too much away, but my Lena, she is the angel of death, basically, guiding those souls that are not going where they're supposed to back on the path. And it's going to be very difficult for her this time because something's missing and they can't go away. So
And
I'm curious.
Go ahead,
I just
Jessica.
love Danielle's stories, and all the stories in the Forgotten Lore series are very fascinating and gothic and creepy. And the stories that I've written for the Forgotten Lore series tend to be kind of ghost-like, ghost stories. And most of my writing deals with people who are LGBTQ community, and so I incorporate a lot of that into my writing and my characters. And I always like to use historical facts, like I think a lot of us steampunks do, which is why I appreciate all the research that Danielle you did for your story, because when we write, we learn so much information that we never even use.
Yeah.
It's amazing what we become experts in. And I think it's a lot of the research part of the story is almost as much fun as the writing part for me.
Definitely. In my last story from A Cry of Hounds, I had to have my character basically bring herself to the brink of death so that she could go to the afterlife to do something that she had to do. And there was actually a compound that they consumed further down in South America. And I found a way to work that in there so that it made sense both historically and from my tech standpoint. So
Oh, I love that.
That sounds vaguely familiar to me. Since the thing about being a demonologist and paranormal investigator is religion, folklore, and mythology and monsters are kind of what I've dedicated all of my life to. Which is, of course, why I love Dracula and Frankenstein. It's like Dracula's where I started with my love of horror and paranormal.
So I think that's so for a lot of people. I think Dracula and Bram Stoker in general and Mary Shelley in general brought people together in literature into this new world we were just talking about. And I love how the monsters of these Forgotten Lore series, especially this volume, are really literary based and are ready to be shared for a new generation of monster lovers.
the really cool thing is that when I was doing the research for the volume to figure out how we could approach it in a way that would be usable for the scavenger hunt, between them, Shelley and Stoker wrote about every single classic horror monster. So we could go anywhere that we wanted.
For both times I've written for Forgotten Lore, I've wound up basically writing tie-in fiction. I came up as a tie-in writer. I've written in 30 different licensed universes, from Star Trek to Alien to Zorro to Supernatural. And for the previous volume, A Cry of Hounds, I wanted to do one of Conan Doyle's more obscure characters, Professor Challenger, who I always loved. And I thought was a different take on the eccentric genius than Sherlock Holmes was. Certainly much louder than Sherlock Holmes was. And
because he also famously a believer, unlike Holmes' hard skepticism.
That only came later, but in any case, I wanted to do a Professor Challenger story, so I did that. For this one, I also wanted to play with one of Shelley's more obscure literary works that's less well known, but still quite interesting. One of my favorite stories of hers is called The Mortal Immortal, which is about a guy in 1833 Europe who is 300 years old, and he tells the story of how he became immortal and what effect that's had on him. And what I did for this one is move his story forward 100 years and have him in the middle of World War I. And how would somebody who cannot die approach the worst war that ever humanity had seen up to that point?
But
That's
isn't
a
that
really
where you
Weirdly-
started.
Weirdly, I didn't plan this. Both of my Forgotten Lore stories take place during World War One, or right after
Okay.
World War One. It's the other one. I don't know why. That's right at the far end of where steampunk really goes, but it's just that's an era that interests me, and that war in particular interests me, even more so than World War II. Partly because it's not as well trod fictional ground, and that was just such a devastating event in Europe.
It really was, and you have an excellent point, because the thing that occurs to me just off the top of my head with doing World War One is everybody does World War II because Nazis are such natural bad guys.
Oh yeah,
but World War One is this huge untapped mine where there were horrible things going on that you could tell stories about, but people don't.
And conveniently, for a steampunk story, they use dirigibles. Like they really actually use dirigibles in World War One.
So I went about mine a different way than Keith, which I guess is pretty normal for Keith and I, because I've done only slightly fewer tie-ins than Keith at this point. But rather than draw on the specific stories, for these anthologies, I prefer to draw on more of the themes and just touch on sort of the structural backgrounds and some of the motifs and things like that. But for the first one we did, Cast of Crows, I was sort of lucky enough to get Detective Dupin as my crow character, who I was supposed to use in my story. That was the motif we were carried through. And I'm a huge Dupin fan, a huge Poe fan in general. I used to teach Poe when I was an English teacher. So I created a character named Philippe Huron, which is actually a pretty deep cut if you're a massive Poe fan. That name actually arises somewhere. I won't tell you where. But he's a Parisian steampunk detective, and so I cast him in sort of a classic locked room mystery in the first one, where he's up on a dirigible and someone gets murdered, and he has to solve it. And Detective Dupin is his crow companion. And so for the second one, I managed to sneak in a Philippe Huron story as a bonus story in the anthology. It's not my main contribution to it. It was my secondary contribution to it. And I got to work in Victor Hugo into that one, which was just massive fun, again, for a literature nerd. And then I actually liked Huron so much that I wrote him in a completely separate anthology for Danielle called Other Ether, where he goes to Hong Kong. And I get to bring him back in an assembly of monsters, which is great. So this is now the fourth Philippe Huron story. And the fourth, so all of his stories are steampunk, all of his stories are mysteries. This is the first one that's got the car. His other stories really were not. So it was really interesting and a lot of fun to get to introduce those elements on top of everything I've already layered in about this character. And I've already warned Danielle that I'm probably just going to keep writing her on until we have enough to do a collection of them or something. So
We have a lot of that going on.
When you land on a good character and you have fun with them, and to get the opportunity to keep telling stories with them is great.
And all the groundwork's already done.
Yeah.
I'm
I'm still part
fun
of research for my book. Okay, Doc.
So, one of the things that I like about writing for the Forgotten Lore stuff is it's always a challenge, and it's always a different challenge. And perhaps I'm not as deeply steeped in the lore as some of the other folks on the panel, but I always like to find something that I can dig into. And for my Cast of Crows story, I wanted to bring in a bit of mysticism and witchcraft into it, and so I created a moon witch who's married to a werewolf, and the thing is, her connection to her deity is so strong. She literally shines with the moonlight at the face of the moon. So that means the only time she and her husband can really be together is during the new moon, because otherwise she changes him. And
They do
So
say
I-
that marriage changes
I-
you. So
I've a bit of a steampunk adventurer who gets lost in the woods and stumbles on this household looking for help, and it's like, oh, this does not end well for you.
Yeah.
Um,
I have to
And-
say, your original ending was okay, but what you transformed it to when I
no, I
gave you
got
feedback was fantastic.
what I. A lot of people don't like edits. I love getting edits because it's like this is what helps me elevate my story to the next level.
Yeah.
yes.
But and for Cry of Hounds, I did a tie into my own novel. I was able to go back to Steampunk Comedy Adventure and have my characters visit a little Greek island. My characters are Professor Harmonious Crackle and Miss Titania Bang, and they're accompanied by a narrator who's an English lord that travels with them. But they land on a small Greek island expecting to have a nice day at the beach and end up running into Cerberus, as you do.
Yeah, it totally happens.
Yeah. And of course, in this story, this for Assembly of Monsters was definitely a challenge because, as Denny said earlier, there are all these different monsters that we could pull from, and I'm at work where I don't have access to email, so
Yeah.
I come home and I
First
see
come,
this
first serve.
long thread of email where everyone else has gone and picked up all the other monsters.
Exactly. The same thing here, Doc. Same thing. I got home and I'm like, oh,
And
okay.
it's like I get this. What am I doing with this?
Uh-huh.
But you got the coolest one because it actually pertains to Shelley's life.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I love the fact that I was able to tie it back to it and actually give the implication that my characters actually are going to interact directly with Shelley. But I got a doppelganger story. So I've got a character who is being basically pursued night after night by a duplicate of himself, and doesn't know what's going on here. His life is bad enough. I don't need this. And of course, you'll have to buy the book to find out how that turns out.
Or they can
I should
support
also-
it on Kickstarter.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say.
I was going to mention. I'm hoping to have a second story in at least one version of the book, assuming we hit the stretch goal where we create a hardcover of this, which would be fabulous. Which means you should all go and support the Kickstarter right now. Well, not right now.
The link is in the description, folks.
Ah, there you go.
Yes, please share it on your Facebook. Don't support the project. I'm already one of the backers.
But I'm
putting
also
it in the chat as well.
the. I also
We're
did
the only
another,
ones who'll see it in the chat, though.
a second
Okay.
story that.
Oh, that's just
yeah.
for us.
Yeah.
Oh well.
Mhm.
I did a second story that will be in the bonus story in the limited edition hardcover, which is another work of tie-in fiction, except it brings together not only the mortal and immortal, but Shelley also wrote a dystopian science fiction novel called The Last Man, where the human race was mostly wiped out by a global pandemic. Because, yeah. A novel that actually has much more resonance now after the events of 4 years ago than it.
Yeah.
So I do have a question for Dacre, because you wrote the intro, not a short story, correct, Dacre?
Correct.
So-
yes.
Obviously, you can't give an elevator pitch for a short story, but I'm curious: did your great granduncle ever comment on Shelley?
Well, funny thing you should say that, Kevin. Good timing, buddy. So, in preparation for this, when James Chambers asked me to get involved in this, and Danielle agreed and said, "Yeah, go for it." I've done an awful lot of research on Bram, and one of the things that had jumped out at me throughout my life was as I was collecting things from some of Bram's great grandson's house. This is where I found the journal, but there was also a letter there, and it within family lore, it's always been that's the connection between Shelley and Stoker, and his mother, Bram's mom. She had 7 kids. and she was a devoted mother and an activist, a female activist. She was, all about mental health issues and so on. One of these letters said, and I'm going to quote it for you: "I have just read a review of Dracula in a London paper. They have not said one word too much of it. No book since Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or indeed any other at all, has come near yours in originality or terror." And I was like, that's the first thing I went to when I thought, oh, they've asked me to do the intro. How do I tie these famous authors together and these stories? So I can't be biased towards one story or the other from all these great authors. I need to be sort of neutral and play both sides. And so what I was looking for was common links, and that letter, really linked it nicely together, as well as the quote I told you guys that I found in the Lost Journal. But the other link that I found, Kevin, was the role that both of these authors sort of played by it being inspired for their seminal works on certain holidays that they took. And this was fairly common, with people who had the means, who traveled with friends, and they went off to interesting places. And Shelley obviously did that with the sort of the famous trip to Lake Geneva when the Indonesian volcano screwed up the world weather. And
one of my favorite history stories.
Exactly. They couldn't hang out outside and row their boats and have their little sandwiches. They stayed indoors in Via Diodata and came up with horrible stories, ghost stories. And there was John Polidori, the doctor who was with them, picked up from Shelley and not Shelley, excuse me, Byron, and continued his fragment of a vampire story. So you got a vampire story, and Mary Shelley starting her Frankenstein, and that sort of began a lot of things. But I went a little bit deeper, as you know, Kevin, and you've been with me on this trip to Transylvania, where I found there was actually a volcanic eruption at the end of Dracula before it was edited out. So there was another little connection to sort of volcanoes. But I did find one other really cool thing to share with the listeners tonight, and that I was like looking, was there any reference to vampirism, any that Shelley had? And it was my son actually helped me find it. He's a PhD scholar, so he dug it, and he actually did work for some guys who were doing a illuminated version of Frankenstein a couple years ago. And he said that, hey, Dad, he found this. Shelley even wrote a one-liner where Dr. Frankenstein referred to his monster as a vampire. And it was like, oh, really? Yes, now we've got the crossover we're looking for. Yeah. I consider the being whom I had cast among mankind and endowed with the will and the power to effect purposes of horror, such as the deed which he had now done, nearly in the light of my own vampire, my own spirit let loose from the grave and forced to destroy all that was dear to me. It was like, God, Parker, you got pay dirt. Now let's put this all together, because now it's a sort of neutral way to approach an intro to these two incredible authors, and to sort of stimulate the readers who have purchased this book to then look at all the stories that these folks on the podcast and the next one you're doing, could kind of put in perspective. That both were so huge and had a respect for each other, which was cool.
I wanted to comment. I'm sorry. One thing that both of these novels did was help in a lot of ways legitimize the novel as a form of writing. Shelley herself viewed what she did as minor, because novels were considered a lesser form of literature, especially in the early part of the 19th century. An entertaining thing I did, one of my first jobs out of college was working for Library Journal magazine, which is the official publication of the library field. And there's articles in the late 19th century issues of Library Journal where they're arguing and wondering, should there be fiction in libraries?
Oh, wow.
Which seems ridiculous now, but that was a very big, and it was, what's especially hilarious, it was exactly like, in tone, the arguments that were going on in the 1990s and early 2000s about whether there should be graphic novels in libraries, whether there should be VHS tapes in libraries, whether there should be DVDs in libraries. The same freaking argument. But at the time, fiction was considered, this sort of weird redheaded stepchild of writing. It's not real literature like poetry or plays or nonfiction. And one of the reasons why the form became so popular is these two books. You know,
There's
hers
one other
at the beginning of the century and his at the end.
But one of the things I liked about these anthologies so far, really, and it's a little less with the first one, A Cast of Crows, because, Poe is known for a lot of different characters because, Poe was a short story writer and he was a poet. So he wrote a multitude of characters. But, when you look at Arthur Conan Doyle, obviously the first one you think of is Holmes, and yet we have, Keith doing a Professor Challenger story. And when Danielle told us, that we were going to be doing Stoker and Shelley for this one, she was very clear about the fact that we were not all going to be writing Dracula and Frankenstein stories.
Yeah.
And I think that's great. That's really exciting because, obviously the ones that we know, what everybody thinks of automatically is Dracula and it is Frankenstein. But both of them were great authors who had written all these really, really cool other stories, especially in the Gothic horror genre. And, personally, like I had not read The Judge's Room, which is the story that I used for inspiration for mine, so that was very cool to get to read a Stoker story that I hadn't read before and to really get excited about that and to find pieces of that to use as references in mine. And, the thought that people coming to these anthologies will say, well, yeah, I mean, I know Dracula and I know Frankenstein, but I don't know these other things. So let me look at these other stories, not just ours, but the ones that ours are based on. Find some pieces by famous authors that you've never even knew existed. And that's pretty cool.
Oh, I think that's amazing. But I was going to say there's one other sort of connection that's interesting that I found out because of that trip I took to Transylvania with Thaker from Patricia, who was with us. She emailed me, I want to say after the trip, to comment on there is a book called The Lives of Necromancers. It was written in 1834 by William Goodwin, Mary Shelley's father.
Oh, wow.
Because William Goodwin was a well-known political writer, just like you commented on Mary Wollstonecraft, who was largely considered the first feminist.
Interesting.
But I'm sorry, someone saying something?
It's just amazing to see where her roots were as a writer. And I think she subtly has a lot of women's rights issues worked into her stories. And that's what I really appreciate about Mary Shelley.
Jessica, I want to add to that for a second. Not too many people pick up on this, but I'm sure this group would. That obviously Mina Harker is, the modern woman. That's Bram's imprint of the feminist in Dracula, and where that comes from, I am convinced, is his mom, who I just touched on very briefly. So Charlotte Stoker bullied her way into the all-male Social and Statistical Inquiry Society in Dublin, Ireland, when it was not a place for a woman to do that, where they were reading papers. And a couple of the papers she read, and I found copies of them, Proper Education of the Deaf and the Mute, how to judge if somebody was criminally insane.
Oh, wow.
So not only is she and the better education of women in workhouses. So not only was she advocating for women's rights, but where do you think the whole idea of Renfield came from, the mental health patient in the novel?
Yeah.
This was Charlotte, as well as Bram's older brother Thornley, who was the medical advisor to the whole novel. His handwriting is all over the typescript, telling Bram how to do the transfusions, the brain trephination surgery, who also dealt with people in two different hospitals in Dublin, mental health as well as physical health places. So where, at least I'm familiar with, where Bram gets some of his inspiration was, family, because they were very close. And I'm just wondering if any of you guys know further things like Jessica just mentioned about, inspiration for Shelley, some of the places she'd been, or what statements she's making. Obviously, we look at now, sort of the whole Frankenstein issue is it's bloody cloning. It's putting together bits and pieces. What a forward-thinking person. What sort of medical background or medical connections did she have? Obviously, somebody on the screen here mentioned galvanism, which was a huge thing at the time. it's really interesting. Like some people say, oh, are they trying to make social statements, or are they just inspired by really things they think personally is cool?
There was a big movement, especially among the Romantic poets, to whom Shelley was married to one, and hung out with several others, about the power of nature. And there's a huge great scene in Frankenstein where they're at Mont Blanc, and Percy Shelley wrote a lengthy epic poem about the wonder and power of the majesty of Mont Blanc as well. And but also, this is when people were actually starting to harness electricity. It wasn't just the thing that happened when there was a thunderstorm. It was actually being harnessed and used as a source of power and running things. And one of the things that she in particular did, whereas Shelley and Coleridge and Byron and Keats were all talking about just in amazement of it and wonder of it, Mary Shelley actually really examined the consequences of it more than the others did.
Yes.
And Frankenstein's about that. The Mortal Immortal's about that. Last Man is about that. So many of her works deal with the consequences of what that power means, and what impact that would have. And I think that was also a huge influence. Is what changes that would wrought.
I think to add to that, it's not just the consequences, but taking responsibility for the outcomes, thinking about not just the benefits of these experiments, but how they can go wrong.
Yeah. Something which Frankenstein famously fails to do.
Right.
Well, I mean, given her background, I mean, with both Godwin and Wollstonecraft, I mean, it was obvious that, of course, she was going to look at the ethical implication. This is how she was raised. I mean, she was raised to be a critical thinker and to really consider the effects in society and the way that society affects the individual.
But and society affected her a hell of a lot.
Yeah.
That's kind of echoed down through a lot of science fiction and speculative fiction that these are stories that are cautionary tales about what happens when mankind goes too far with something that they've discovered.
It's also something I've always said, even when I was a kid, about fiction. People think the obvious surface thing is think of fiction as a story that isn't true. But in many important ways, good fiction, like Dracula and Frankenstein, in every important way, what's being said is true, because they're dealing with real ethical issues that come up with something like cloning.
Yeah.
The other thing I'd say for interesting connections, just like Bram Stoker got the name Dracula from Vlad Tepes, there was a historical necromancer named Conrad Dippel who worked out of an actual Castle Frankenstein in Germany. There's no direct evidence that that's where she got the name, but we know she and Percy traveled along the Rhine River, and the castle was overlooking the Rhine River, and that this guy was an alchemist, he was a necromancer, he was a scientist. There's lots of dark stories of him digging up dead bodies and doing bizarre experiments, and it seems really unlikely there wasn't at least a little bit of influence there. At least
having said that, the idea of there being a castle is straight out of the movie. That's not out of the novel. But
there are in fact two Castle Frankensteins.
Yeah. I've got an electricity story for you guys. Okay, because it's great when we get going, and it's not so much spooky, but it is that Stoker and Irving, were really cutting edge tech at the Lyceum Theater, and even though they still had gas lighting, they couldn't afford to have electric lighting. That came a little bit later, but one thing they did do, which I still find incredibly interesting when you look at modern day movies, is the second most famous play that Bram put on and Irving played in during the 27 years was Faust. And of course, the role of Mephistopheles, this devil creature, is, I'm sure, one of the inspirations for Bram's Count Dracula. But there's a sword fighting scene in that stage play, and Bram and Irving found somebody in London to come in and wire up the two actors with metal plates, grounded them, and had rubber gloves on. So when they had their sword fighting scene, the swords, much like modern day epées, which I did as an athlete, but when they were electrified, when they hit each other, sparks would fly out. Now, that's like freaking lightsaber fighting in Star Wars
Yeah.
back in the
Nice.
Victorian era. And
Lightning
this
They
is
did the
because
same.
Shocking.
God.
that's
Lightning
They did almost the
absolutely.
exact same thing when they made the original Highlander. They hooked the actors up to
Yeah.
car batteries, run out, to
They
the,
had batteries.
and that goes all the way back to Lyceum Theater. That's amazing.
Yeah.
And
That-
especially in Highlander, they were standing in freaking water. It was the most
Yeah.
dangerous thing ever.
Yeah.
But having dabbled in acting, trust me, I get that whole. You don't think about how stupid the thing you're doing is until later.
Yeah.
Luckily, nobody was seriously injured or shocked in that event, and the crowd loved it. Lots of
Oh, I
smoke,
bet.
lots of sparks. You know.
People
I
will
know,
forgive
that
anything if it looks cool.
phenomenal effect. Yeah, they will.
Now, that's just got me thinking that one of the things in my Crackle and Bang universe is that the reason that Pax Britannia continues so strongly is because the Brits are armed with lightning rifles, and it's like, and now it's like, okay, how do I work lightning sabers into this?
There you go.
There's always a
Without
way.
getting screwed by
There's
Disney.
always a way.
Start with the bayonet.
Uh,
Well, no, it's clearly not a problem with Disney. It is a lightning saber, not a
so
lightsaber.
it's not a lightsaber. It's a
Yeah, but
lightning.
you don't want to
Distinguishable
want to
from
mess
a
with Disney
lightsaber.
lawyers.
Yeah.
You
But
really
even
don't.
realistically, they're not going to work the same way.
No.
Yeah.
No.
I love
So
that.
I've got another one for the crowd here. Think about this, and I'm not trying to take over Kevin's job. He's doing a great
No,
one.
please.
But here's the
Kevin's
sort of a
lazy.
question
Take it over. No.
for everybody to think about. Both novels obviously deal with creation, right, of creatures in their own way.
Yeah.
But the finality of death at the end of the story is very ambiguous. I deal with it all the time. Was Dracula really killed? Oh, there wasn't a wooden stake. Oh, how could he be killed? There was a Bowie knife, and he disappeared in the dust. And now I've told you guys one of the secrets. There was a volcanic eruption that got edited out. And Frankenstein sort of drifts off on an ice floe. So why do you think both novels left these endings ambiguous? What was the message there? What do you think the authors are doing?
I have
I
thoughts,
really
but I want to
think-
hear other people.
It's what you're saying, creation, and the idea of humans as gods trying to become godlike by creating life. So in vampires, when they have their victims, they're killed. When they drink from their victims, they can actually turn, in some mythologies, them into vampires as well. So in that way, they're creating life by killing. In the similar way to Frankenstein, they used death to create life. And I think that was a fascinating part of the Victorian era where they were obsessed with death. It was the coolest thing around. Death was happening. And so I think way that people like in Shelley's era and Stoker's era were so fixated on the wars that were going on, the diseases, that they needed to find some way of finding some justice in there. And the only way to do it for humanity at the time was to create something better. But when you're trying to create out of pride, it turns into something worse.
This makes me.
There was something that both Jessica and Dacre mentioned that I think is worth mentioning, is that one of the many things that took leaps forward in the 19th century is medical science.
Yeah.
Under both understanding of how the physical body works, understanding of things like germs and transmission of disease and such. A lot of that was learned in the 19th century, as well as the strides forward made in mental health by Freud and his contemporaries. And that, but in terms of the question that Dacre asked, I think a lot of it is that you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah.
Pandora's box, really. It's
Right.
especially because it's a cautionary tale with Frankenstein. You know, it's about the release of that science into the world once it's out there, it's out there.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think
It's not solved by just killing it. Because
I also think symbolically, life is a cycle, and being obsessed with death, you're also obsessed with the afterlife. And so by not having something definitive, they're going beyond. You just don't know what beyond is.
Well, yeah, I mean, both of them in a way, I mean, they both break the natural cycle. So it makes sense for them not to revert to the natural cycle. You know, you've already broken this pattern. And again, like you said, you can't put it back. So both of them have to then, as you were saying, go off somewhere else. You can't just cycle it back in again.
I also think there's an element. Oh, sorry, Kevin.
No, go ahead. Because I'll explain why, but go ahead.
Just thinking at it purely from a kind of a mechanical author perspective, it occurs to me that there's something about the ambiguous ending is just always stronger and more memorable than a definitive ending. You know, if Dracula is just dead and gone at the end of the book, it's like, okay, then you can kind of forget the story happened, it's over. If it's ambiguous, or the Frankenstein monster, they're still out there. It makes the reader just kind of keeps them in their mind. And I think that's a very smart sort of author instinct that both of them shared, is that if you leave the potential for the story to continue, even if it never does, it just has more staying power, I think.
Well, it's especially
these
true
are
with
both
horror, right?
stories about immortals. I mean, Dracula made some kind of unholy deal for his own immortality. Frankenstein was built against his will, but once he was built, he was immortal. And it's like he's one of the few characters you find who actually yearns for death, because his continued existence is horrific for it. But leaving those endings vague is just the idea of, you know, these are two characters who have defied the natural order, and part of their curse is they must continue. They you know, how do you kill an immortal? you might injure
really
them, you might
blade.
defeat them, but you can't get rid of them.
Okay, two things. One, I have a point I want to make. Two, I want to point out that we're coming up on 9:00. We can keep going if people are available, but I will have to restart the stream. But the thing I wanted to say, and this is why I'm happy to wait and let everybody else speak, is I had the original comment I wanted to make based on what Jessica said. And it has changed a little bit as every single one of you have added to the discussion. And I think I have a better point to make because of what you've made me think of than I originally did. So thank you. But I think a big theme that you run into in both books is this idea of man, or at least man's creation, supplanting God. Because obviously it is the subtitle of Frankenstein, a modern Prometheus. It's stealing the secret knowledge of the gods, the ability to create life, and bringing it to man. In Dracula, I mean, you're going to drink my blood, and in through my blood, you're going to have eternal life. Could the metaphor for the Holy Mass of Catholicism be more obvious? I think there's almost kind of an element here of, this is the other side of becoming a god. They have gained this immortality and this great power, either being given it like the monster or by his deal with Dracula. And now you get the other side of the coin. Now you are now a god that cannot die, cursed to walk the earth.
So it's not just so they could write a sequel later on.
Yeah,
that was going to be my first response.
no, that's
really a thing. Yeah.
The inevitable sequel, but
Yeah.
No, nobody did sequel. Nobody ever does
Dracula
sequel.
2 this time.
Dracula harder.
Since we
Dracula
are coming up on the hour,
Well, I
coming
think
up
the
on the hour, I'd like to
ambiguity-
point out that if you haven't pledged to the Kickstarter yet, this is a perfect time to do it because there are 8 more slots left to be in the first 100 and get special bonuses. So if you haven't pledged and you're thinking about it, do it now.
Our operators are
There's so many
standing
good
by.
bonuses.
That's right.
There's so many fun bonuses that I'm excited I'm getting, and I just love when I get notifications. We hit this tier mark, and it's like, oh, I'm getting more free stuff. Awesome.
Exactly.
Three full books already.
Yeah.
And we're less than 500 away from unlocking another novel.
Come on, folks,
Awesome.
subscribe. So, are people available? Do people need to dash?
I,
you need
I
to
need
go.
to dash, unfortunately.
I unfortunately have work tomorrow, so
Totally understood.
As do I. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then, probably
Thank you,
best
Kevin.
just to wrap. Thank you for joining us. It's always a pleasure. To all of my new friends, thank you as well. I'll tell you what I've told Daniel and Dacre many times. I've had you on my show once. You are welcome back.
Okay.
Thank you.
thank you for having
You've
us.
all been really enjoyable guests. I'm really glad you came.
thank
So
you.
that's
Thank you
guys.
so much.
for tonight,
sounds
everyone. I want to thank our listeners for listening in. This is Kevin Mears, demonologist and Paranormal Encyclopedia, saying good night. Brian?
Brian McKinley saying, keep your fangs sharp.
Good night and God bless everybody.
All right.
Good
That'll
night.
do it for
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Tune in 8 o'clock next week when we'll be having more guests on from this great collection
There you go.
and stream. So I wanted to add a fun, unrelated story.